The first image is simple and searing. A wooden door splintered inward, sunlight cutting through a dim room in harsh August light. A pair of leather boots step over the threshold and into straw. The camera, if there were a camera, would linger on the boots for a beat, then tilt down to a thin hand waiting on a wall, ribs visible under skin, a chain coiled around a wrist like an accusation. That is the moment the story becomes a single, undeniable sentence. A Japanese woman crying as American soldiers rescue her from slavery. Her name was Keiko. Some records spell a different surname. Sources disagree between Tanaka and Tanaka. For what matters here, she will be Keiko, the woman who waited for death for 16 months and on an afternoon in August 1945 found herself blinking in the open light. 16 months is not a number to wear lightly. To live inside it is to learn time as a string of small humiliations and harder, quieter survivals. At first, the months blur into days. A ration of rice, the weight of a bucket, the swing of a broom for someone else's house, a whispered reprimand. Then the cruelty becomes habitual. The cruelty and the rules tighten until they are the only geography she knows. She was taken from a place of whatever life she had left and kept in a coastal village on northern Luzon in the Philippines. The man who kept her, a local trader named Eduardo Reyes, moved between the public and the private with an ease Keiko could not cross. To the village he sold goods. To the walls of the cabin he kept a locked, small room. To that room he assigned Keiko. The first block of memory is small and sharp. The first night she was bound. The chain bit into skin then, like an intended punctuation. Later, there were blows with a belt that left her body with proofs it could not hide. And there was the steadiness of hunger that hollowed her cheeks until her eyes seemed to float. There were nights when the moon watched without offering advice, and days when the sea's voice at a distance made a sound like freedom that Keiko could not reach. She learned to make herself small. She learned how to time her breath so it did not startle anyone. Sometimes she would sit with her knees folded, listening to the village outside the thin walls, the voices of kids, the creak of oars, the bargaining at the market. Life continued beyond the shack, but for her, the world had narrowed to the space between a chained wrist and a wall. Thinking about the way people survive in small violences is to notice the particulars, where the light falls, the shape of a plate, the tiny rituals that mark a person's day. Keiko kept a scrap of paper she found in a drawer. On it, with a stub of pencil, she drew faces, circles with lines for hair and eyes, anything to affirm a hand could still make marks. That small act of drawing mattered more than safety. It was a proof she could still speak with something other than sound. The drawings were not finished pictures. They were shorthand for people she remembered or feared or hoped for. Over months, the little pages multiplied and hid in the folds of ragged clothes. They became a private witness. Her training in fear was thorough. When soldiers passed near the village, tracer lights, vehicles, orders, Keiko's heart learned to identify the noise and translate it into danger, not rescue. Years of isolation, of stories told and retold about what uniformed men meant, had narrowed her expectation. Hands could hurt or betray. That expectation was a cage inside the cage. The house itself had the smell of damp straw and old sweat, the kind of smell that stays in the bones. The floor was straw, the walls thin, and the light came in strips where the wood had rotted away. On the wall nearest where she slept, someone had scratched a symbol she could not read, a kind of map she never needed to follow. It mattered because when the door finally broke, the light found that mark, and for the first time in a long while, Keiko could see clean shapes on a wall. The day the door broke, the air had that late summer heat that makes a throat feel dry even inside. It smelled of salt and smoke, the sea distant but present like a memory. The men who came to the door were not silent shadows. They had boots that clacked, a conversation caught and broken by orders, the metallic scent of weapons at their belts. They were soldiers, Americans by their pockets and the small cloth patches on their sleeves. Among them was a young man with eyes the color of storm water. His name was James. He moved with a kind of determined gentleness, the sort of movement that treats a fragile thing as if it belongs to the world, not to itself. There was also a medic, a man who had the calm, dry way of people who have seen more broken bodies than they have words for healing them. He and James cleared the room with practiced urgency, splitting their attention between threat and care. A Nisei interpreter walked just behind them, face composed, hands ready to translate. He did not look like the rest. His presence made the group a thin bridge between cultures, between the language of orders and the language of someone who would understand the voice of a woman who had been taught to fear uniforms. When the door fell, it did so with the sound of wooden bones snapping. The light poured in and cut through the dust. Keiko had become a creature of the dark. When light hit her eyes, it hurt. For a moment, she thought she had been given something worse than violence: exposure. Eyes turned toward her, and the chain on her wrist glinted. She was aware of every sound as if each might be the sound of a hand approaching to take or to strike again. The soldiers moved with a rhythm made of training and compassion. They called out, low and quick, and the interpreter stepped forward. The medic held out a soft voice like a hand to lead a frightened animal. Names were not the language of rescue that first moment. The medicine came later. The first gift was a declaration. It was James who said it. He knelt, not to look at her from above, but to lower his height so his gaze could meet whatever small part of her wanted to watch another human. He reached out his hand, not to bind, not to restrain, but to hold her shoulder in a way that gave her a place to rest. "You are safe now," he said. 3 words, not a treaty, not a promise unmade, not a sermon, just a short sentence folded with intention. You are safe now. For a woman who had been taught to expect doors only as transitions toward punishment, those 3 words were unfamiliar grammar. They pressed against the dented places in her memory and, at once, opened a fissure. Her first reaction was not relief. Relief would have been too foreign. Instead, she recoiled, as if the touch itself could be poison. Habits of withdrawal are stubborn. The body knows how to shrink away. But James did not pull back. His fingers stayed on the ruff of her shoulder, steady and unhurried. The medic produced scissors and began to cut the chain, a sound like metal surrendering. Keiko flinched at the clink, then listened. The chain fell with a small final sound and landed like a punctuation mark on the straw. When the chain dropped, the world rewritten itself in the smallest of ways. Her hand stung as if it had just been peeled from ice. The skin around the wrist showed the imprint of the metal and a bruise that would never fully fade. But there was air, breath that could be taken in without the immediate suspicion of being a wrong move. Tears came not because pain was over. Tears came because something she had not expected to feel had entered the room: permission. The first wetness on her cheeks was not sobbing. It was the relic of a long drought in which the body had forgotten how to make noise. She pressed her lips thin, measured the shape of her mouth. Then, because muscles remember how to give up, she let go. The words that came were not English. The interpreter adjusted, listening to the syllables of a language he knew. They were a rough, soft sound, something like a child's calling for a parent. "You are safe now," James repeated, this time softer. The phrase, said twice, became a kind of soft instrument that vibrated across Keiko's ribs. The sound of English became less like a threat and more like a chord she could follow. The interpreter translated the idea into a phrase that matched something she knew. A loose, tentative trust began to thread between them. It was not full confidence, that would take months, but it was a start. Small acts began to follow the sentence. The medic unbuttoned a shirt and replaced it with a clean shirt he had. A soldier unwound a blanket, an olive-green military blanket, and draped it over her shoulders like a mantle of ordinary care. It was a simple thing, a piece of cloth, but in that room it felt more like a new skin. Someone produced water and held it to her lips. Keiko's hands, calloused and thin, trembled as she took the cup. The first swallow brought with it the salt of survival and the memory that water can mean the end of thirst and the start of something else. One soldier produced a small bar of chocolate, an object that under other skies would have been a treat. Here it was an offering almost ceremonial. He unwrapped it and broke it into pieces, presenting a small fragment. Keiko looked at it as if it were a jewel. She accepted a sliver and let it melt on her tongue like an event, like proof that the human mouth could receive joy as well as suffering. It was a minor sacrament, sweetness, a shard of normality amidst months of enforced abnormality. The sketchbook surfaced soon after. A young soldier, less raw than the others, but with a kind face, found it tucked under a loose floorboard. He opened it and saw the drawings, faces, crude boats, a line that might have been a house. He did not laugh. He smoothed a page as if it were fragile. Keiko watched the hands that held her life with attention she had not thought she could spare. The drawings were translated not into words but into presence. One of the soldiers, perhaps sensing a chance to communicate where speech could not, took a stub of pencil and, with a shaky inventory of shapes, drew a sun on the page and a small boat. He set the pencil down carefully and pushed it toward her. She took the pencil as if preserving it from wind. For a moment she hesitated, as if she were trying to remember if hands could be used to make lovely things. Then she drew, a slow, deliberate mark. The pencil scratched across the page and made a line that could have been any story, but was, in that second, a story she could sign to. The soldier smiled, small and private. The interpreter, who had been watching, said the English word the others had said in the cabin, "free." The word hung there like a flag. Through the interpreter's translations and the soldier's gestures, a new language formed around Keiko, one of food, clothing, a bandage placed with care, a blanket laid over shoulders. None of it erased the facts of what had happened. None of it promised that wounds would disappear overnight. But it shaped a present in which someone had chosen to care for her, not to take from her. That distinction, the difference between taking and giving, was, for Keiko, the beginning of a recalibration of trust. Even amid these small mercies, her body held the stories of abuse. Her back carried thread-like scars. Her ribs had the memory of blows that tempered the breath. She slept at odd hours in the days after rescue, because her internal clock had been set to the times she had survived. The medic could see her fractures were old and not always properly healed. He worked quickly, with the efficient hands of someone used to triage. He cleaned sores with the professional detachment of a man whose life is saving other lives, and then he paused whenever she flinched to speak gentleness into his work. One of the things that surprised Keiko, surprised everyone watching, was how quickly gestures took on meaning. A bar of soap became a ritual. Washing, in the camp, was not only for hygiene, it was an act of reclaiming a body that had been objectified. A tiny ceremony that said, "You matter." The medic placed a bowl of warm water at her feet. Keiko watched it for a long time, as if expecting the water to have a hidden danger. When she finally put her hands into it, it was like dipping into another world. The water washed away more than dirt. It took with it the sheen of confinement, and in its place left the simple fact of clean skin. Outside that dark room, life pressed on in 100 small ways. The interpreter learned some of Keiko's words. She learned a few English phrases, enough to point at things, to say commands, to refuse. The camp became a place of small negotiations. There were other Japanese civilians and soldiers processed nearby. There were Filipino villagers watching from a distance. And there were American officers recording events and making sense of what had happened. The atmosphere was a strange confluence: orders and tenderness, interrogation and blankets. The soldiers who had found Keiko did not change the world with one act. Their gesture did not erase the larger violence that had been done. But in a single cabin, at a single moment, they made a choice that created a different future for one person. The moment when James kept his hand on her shoulder, when he did not withdraw even as she recoiled, was not theatrical. It was a labor of patience. It was the recognition that a human being whose will has been battered still carries, inside, the capacity to accept kindness. After the first contact, she began to nod to small things. She accepted a warm blanket. She nodded when someone pointed and said, "Water," through the interpreter. The first night outside the shack, she slept on a mat in a makeshift medical tent. Not in the luxury of a bed, but somewhere with a ceiling and fabric that kept the wind from sharpening like a blade. The tent smelled of disinfectant and the heat of bodies. When she closed her eyes, the sound of other people breathing was alarming at first, and then a sort of comfort. For 16 months she had had to develop a careful blindness to others. Now the same crowded breathing meant safety, because it had, finally, been chosen for her rather than forced. At the camp, James walked with a kind of careful slowness around her. He brought water in a tin cup and left it where she could reach. He sat at the edge of the mat and once drew a small sailboat in her sketchbook, simple lines that echoed the ones she had drawn for herself. Keiko watched and, without formal words, traced the shape of his boat with a finger. The gesture, shared marks on the page, was an exchange that did not demand language. Only later would anyone try to interpret such moments as symbolic or redemptive. At the time, they were smaller. A soldier teaching a woman how to make a boat on paper. This was enough for them both. There were, of course, complexities. The camp was not a place of uniformly benevolent actors. There were people who declined to treat those perceived as enemy nationals with the same level of sympathy. There were practicalities, questions about where she had come from, who had held her, what the village knew, and those questions needed answering because justice required facts. But in the first hours, the contested things were background noise to the human, intensely present need to be clean, fed, seen. Keiko could not sleep without a light in the corner of the tent. The darkness had been weaponized against her for so long that even a sliver of shadow brought back commands and sharp hands. James would not force conversation. He sat beside the light and kept watch. A Nisei interpreter sat nearby, writing down small things Keiko wanted to remember: names, a description of the trader, words for mother and sister in the staccato rhythm of her speech. The interpreter's notebook eventually filled with sketches, too. He drew the way Keiko described the sea and the curve of a boat. Those little drawings were, in effect, a translation that crossed borders. As the night folded and the camp settled into an uneasy quiet, Keiko reached into the fold of her ragged clothing and produced one more page, the one she had kept closest. On it was a face that looked like someone waiting for home. With the pencil they had given her, she darkened the eyes until they were two black points on paper. When James leaned over, the corner of his mouth went up, a private, gentle smile. He called the interpreter over, and they spoke softly about how to mend the shoulders that flinched when someone reached out. These small acts, blanket, water, chocolate, drawing, are the stitches that begin the tedious work of stitching a life back together. No single item healed Keiko's wounds. Rather, the accumulation of care, repeated and consistent, redrew the lines of what it meant to be human in a world that had tried to reduce her to labor and silence. When someone touches a shoulder without an intent to claim something, it teaches a body that hands can be safe. When someone offers food that is not a bribe, it teaches trust about hunger. When a stranger sits and draws beside you, it teaches that you are worth attention. We pause here to note something small and necessary. The image that anchors this tale is the one the title names so plainly: the Japanese woman crying as American soldiers rescue her from slavery. That picture is both literal and emblematic. It is literal because on that day in August 1945, Keiko did weep as soldiers and medics entered her life and ended her immediate captivity. It is emblematic because those tears are not only about the end of a physical chain, they are about the collapse of a mental architecture built to expect only harm. That collapse is painful. Tears are messy. They are the body's way of reconciling the past's weight with a newly possible present. If this story asks anything of the listener, it asks that you hold two truths together: that violence happened, and that acts of care can, sometimes, begin to undo its effects. It resists simple certainties. It insists that one person's choice to help does not absolve larger systems that allowed the abuse to continue. It insists also that in the face of destruction, humans still make decisions to repair. Leave a comment if you have heard stories like this, of someone saved not by abstract forces, but by individual acts of care. The detail matters: the seam of a blanket, the giving of a pencil, the steadiness of a hand. The next hours after the shack were a practical blur. Keiko was gently helped into a truck that served as a makeshift ambulance. The soldiers wrapped the olive-green blanket tighter around her shoulders. Someone tucked the sketchbook into her hands and, like a talisman, suggested she keep it close. James lifted her with the care of a man who pretends to know the weight of what he is carrying. She lay against him, and in that close, James felt the faint tremor of someone whose bones were still set to listen for footsteps that might be harsh. She did not sleep as the truck jostled over the rutted path toward the medical camp. Instead, she pressed the sketchbook to her chest, holding the line between the past and now. As the vehicle moved, Keiko closed her eyes and let the wind, warm, saline, real, brush her face. She cried again, softer now, and the sound was not for the soldiers alone. It was for the lost months, the names on the pages of her small book, the small boats that kept appearing in her drawings. It was a sound that meant grief and relief could live in the same mouth without canceling each other out. The truck crawled up over a ridge and the sea became visible, a wide, indifferent expanse. It would be some time before Keiko could think of that sea as freedom rather than a border. For now, as the camp tents came into view and the medical lights hummed like distant stars, she held the pencil between finger and thumb and drew a boat. The line was steady. The boat had a small sail, and inside its hull, a single dot that might have been a person. The curtain of the first night's rescue had fallen. The stage was not yet cleared. There were conversations that needed to happen, records that would be taken, an aggressor to be identified and legally pursued. The story on that day, however, was narrower. A chain broken, hands that did not withdraw, and a woman named Keiko taking in water and chocolate and the knowledge that someone had, for a time, chosen to make her safe. The sketchbook, damp at the corners from her tears, was tucked like evidence and promise in her lap as the truck carried her toward a place with medicine, questioning, and the small rituals that could, slowly, put a life back together. The truck bumped into the camp and the tent flap was lifted for them. Hands moved with precise economy, an extension of the same discipline that had broken the door open. They eased Keiko onto a cot beneath the white canvas, and the medic began a methodical inspection, cleaning, dressing, counting. The light inside the tent was steady and purposeful, a different kind of exposure than the sudden harshness of a door falling in. Here they named wounds, named needs, and prepared lists. They wrote her name down as best they could. Keiko watched the pen move, watched the letters form like a language trying to catch up with a life. Weeks folded into one another with the steady work of care. The camp functioned as a place of triage and transition. Men and women with different stories of the war came and went. Soldiers with amused resentments, civilians with wary eyes, interpreters who knew 3 kinds of grief. Among them the Nisei interpreter, his hands sure on the paper, his pauses exact, helped Keiko tell what she could. He learned the soft consonants of her words. She learned to say a few more English phrases. The medic wrote the facts that had to be recorded. The dates of captivity as Keiko could remember them, the place she had been taken from, the name she used for the man who had held her. Other officers filled forms and made calls that were the bureaucratic echo of what had happened in that shack. The procedural steps were necessary but awkward. Law and compassion pressed up against each other. Officers took statements, and in the polite, clipped way of military record-keeping, they asked questions that felt invasive to Keiko's internal logic. She answered in fragments, sometimes with the interpreter's voice filling soft gaps. When a civilian witness from the village came, someone who had noticed the shack, who had seen a woman who did not belong appear and then disappear, their testimony joined the small pile of evidence that would become the basis for a charge. The man they named as the captor, Eduardo Reyes, was arrested not by rumor but by a ledger of facts. A wall scratched with a certain symbol, a buyer's ledger, a scar the size of a thumb on a placket of cloth that matched an account from the camp. The arrest itself was abrupt and unmistakably local. Soldiers moved through the marketplace with an authority that churned curiosity into hush. Eduardo was taken in the open, among the pallets of fish and sacks of rice. He was not graceful about it. There was no grand speech. There was only the clack of handcuffs and the shock on the faces of those who had learned to live with his commerce. His wife cried and called after him in the throng. Neighbors stood back, folding their hands like a public prayer. Later, in interviews, several villagers described a man who had been part of their public commerce and private cruelty. Someone who kept separate rooms and locked certain doors. Their accounts lined up enough that officers could move from suspicion to charge. The legal machinery of occupation was new to many of those involved. Military police and investigators worked with interpreters to assemble testimony that would stand in a tribunal. Keiko's sketchbook became, unexpectedly, a kind of personal registry. Pages with faces and boats and eyes that looked like holes and houses that were only lines. Officers paged through it carefully as if searching for a map that might point them to other facts. The sketches were not evidence in a strict forensic sense, but they humanized the ledger. For those who read them, the drawings made the person behind the forms visible. Not a number or a case file, but someone who had been present and persistent enough to mark the world on paper. The charge against Eduardo was framed in the language of the time: crimes committed under conditions of war, offenses against civilian rights, and a pattern of coercion and deprivation. The trial that followed was not theatrical, but formal, and it unfolded in a makeshift courtroom where the urgency of rebuilding had not lessened the need for justice. Witnesses were called: villagers who spoke softly into microphones, a few people who had seen the signs. The prosecution laid out a case built from records, testimony, and the testimony of the woman who had been kept in the shack. Keiko sat with a blanket over her knees and the sketchbook on her lap. The presence of those pages mattered more than any single word she would speak. When her turn came, the interpreter knelt to her as he had in the cabin, and let her say what she could. She spoke in bursts. She gave names when she could. She drew a line on the paper to show where a door had been. She traced with a trembling finger the small faces she had drawn months earlier. Proof that someone had been there, alive enough to mark. The tribunal had before it not only the statements of a victim and the ledger of her captor, but also an image, a human face that had been erased from public life and insistently put back. In the end, the court found Eduardo guilty. He was sentenced in accordance with the codes applied by the occupying authorities. The verdict did not undo the months of confinement. It did, however, make an official statement that this was not a private wrong, beyond the reach of law. For Keiko, it was recognition that someone had been held accountable. For others, it was an administrative closure, one sequence in a long series of attempts to impose order on a chaotic world. The point is not to glorify the law, but to insist that when institutions do their work, they can offer a cleft of recognition in which a human life can reassert itself. After the trial, the practical question of what comes next moved to the foreground. Repatriation was organized, lists compiled, transport arranged. The work of returning civilians to their countries, of taking the living back to what remained, was logistically immense in the months after August. Keiko's journey home would be a slow arc, weeks of processing, a conveyance by ship that carried people in various stages of weariness and hope, a patchwork of strangers who had been given the same free passage to some version of return. In one of the small tents where returns were organized, Keiko met Yuki, a woman who had been in the region and who would later play a quiet role in helping ease the last steps across the ocean. Yuki had a voice that seemed to carry the shore. She had been displaced too, and knew, by the way Keiko's shoulders tightened or relaxed, when to speak and when to be silent. They spoke in fragments and shared a cigarette once as sailors prepared documents. Yuki taught Keiko a phrase in a dialect that reminded her of home. Keiko taught Yuki how to draw a boat that was somehow lighter on the page. Those shared minutes were not major events in the administrative arc of repatriation, but they were the human exchange that rearmed Keiko's sense that the world contained people who would choose to be kind. The voyage back to Japan, when it came, was quiet in a way that made the mind louder. On the deck, Keiko would stand with a sketchbook closed in her hands, and the wind would strip the hair from her forehead and leave salt on her cheeks. Some nights she slept on a bunk with strangers breathing in time above and below her, and the closeness was both disturbing and reassuring. Fellow passengers had their own stories. Children with eyes too old for their faces, old men who held photographs of houses with roofs missing. The boat meandered along shipping lanes and docked in places that were both foreign and already familiar in the sense that the entire world had been rearranged. When the ship moored in Japan, the sight of the shoreline was not the triumphant return of a triumphant soldier. It was less cinematic and more like stepping into an ongoing conversation you had been absent from. Ports were crowds of thumbnails, faces pressed to the railings, flags patched onto cloth. People called names and pressed food into hands and looked for those they had feared lost. Keiko disembarked with a small bundle and the sketchbook in the crook of her arm. She went by train and then by foot toward the town where she had last spoken with her mother and sister. The reunion was both ordinary and unimaginable. A woman who had not believed she would live to be noticed in the world again pressed her face to the one who had given her life. Her mother stood a little unsteady, hands trembling like reed grass. Her sister, thinner, older, shaped by the wartime years, embraced her in a way that snapped both of them into a new place. There were awkward questions and a kind of mutual measuring. How to live together when the world they knew had changed into one with holes. Keiko's mother wept and then composed herself with a practicalness that can exist only out of long endurance. She produced a basin of hot water and a clean kimono and set about doing what she could with what she had. For Keiko, the simple act of having someone press rice into her hands felt like a covenant that something human remained. Returning home did not close the inside of things. Keiko carried, invisibly, a required vigilance. Doors remained suspect. Dark rooms continued to compress her. She slept with a thin lantern for years. Voices at night made her start. Loud boots on a wooden floor conjured not merely a sound, but a body of memory. She learned coping strategies. Washing carefully as a ritual twice a day, drawing before sleep to place the scrap of paper between that night and the one she could not yet bear, keeping the sketchbook under her pillow. Yet within that careful architecture of survival, she also found a route into living. The Red Cross and a few humanitarian groups offered trainings for those who wanted to learn practical skills. Some offered support for resettlement. Keiko chose, slowly, to train in basic nursing. It was a field where hands could be used to help, where there was steady work, and where small acts of care could meet another person's need. The rhythm of nursing suited her: measured tasks, repetition, the possibility of being useful. In time she worked in a small clinic, where the wounded, some of them children, came with burns or fevers or wounds that were more properly wounds of poverty than war. She learned to stitch, to place a dressing, to lull a child into sleep with the murmur of a voice. The work did not erase the past, but it taught her how to translate the attention that had sustained her into attention she could give. Community did the rest. Neighbors slowly reconstituted ordinary days. People shared tea and stories about trivial things, the weather, the price of fish, until those things regained enough texture to be lived with. Keiko, with her sketchbook always near, began to teach children how to draw simple boats and faces. She placed paper on a low table and showed little hands how to make a circle for a head, a line for a smile. The children's laughter was not a cure, but it was a tender counterpoint to the silence that had lived in Keiko's chest. Through those drawings, she gave back some of the language that had once been salvific for her. She became, in a small domestic way, a person who fixed things. Years passed with a pattern of minor victories and recurring shadows. She found friends in colleagues at the clinic, women who had known different kinds of loss and who fashioned community out of shared labor. She did not speak often about the shack unless asked. When she did, her voice moved in a narrow band of practical detail. Sometimes the sketchbook was shown to newcomers. "This is mine," she would say simply, and open it to the boats. The images carried a soft power. They were both testimony and survival kit, a record that she had lived through weeks that years later were legible only in small marks. Legal closure of Eduardo Reyes's case did not bring personal closure to Keiko. It supplied a public recognition, which matters in the making of a social record. But the private work of living with memory was ongoing. Nightmares visited in chapters. Sometimes she woke with the taste of salt and the sound of splintering wood. Sometimes she would find herself holding a pencil and drawing a small boat in the margin of a medical log. Sometimes a smell, tar or fried fish, or the specific rust of a chain would send her back to the straw floor for a single slow breath. Friends learned the cues. If Keiko started to fold away her hands or refused a blanket, they would ask softly, and she would nod and they would adjust. None of these things made the story less real, they simply marked the ordinary persistence of after effects. There were also moments of quiet restoration. On anniversaries, she would visit the sea and sit on a low stone and trace a line in the sand. She would sometimes place a small folded paper boat on the tide and watch it skitter and sink and sometimes travel a little way. People who saw her there would not always guess the story beneath. She preferred it that way. There is a dignity in not being defined solely by one moment. The sketchbook accompanied her to the clinic, to markets, to modest celebrations. It accumulated additions, a child's doodle, an elderly neighbor's shaky bird, until it became less solely hers and more a communal thing. A book that carried the small marks of a life not erased. As she grew older, she became known, in the modest community that had taken her, as a woman who could steady a trembling hand. That identity was both a gift and an accommodation. She had been given the tools to help someone else face fever and injury. The nursing work offered a discipline that kept her grounded. It also provided a channel for the deep empathy she had acquired through suffering. The ability to know which small kindnesses mattered in a clinic room and which mattered in the larger back and forth of human living. When she died, decades later in 1993, at an age held in simple dignity, those who knew her remembered her as someone who had navigated both cruelty and grace, and who had not allowed her story to become only a wound. After her funeral, in the simple house where she had lived for many years, someone opened a cedar box filled with her papers. Among old letters, yellowed ration slips, and a small tin of pencils, lay the sketchbook, edges softened by years of thumb and rain. The pages inside had a chronology both private and public. Boats, faces, a map that might have been a coastline. The occasional careful note written in a hand that had been steadied by practice. There were dates, sometimes, and the faint marks of a life that had learned to mark the world back. The sketchbook traveled then from the private house to those who would keep the traces of her life. Friends, perhaps a small historical society, perhaps a clinic archive. Those who turned its pages saw the boat drawings and the faces, and they read in them something the formal records never fully convey, the texture of someone's interior persistence. The book was later used in small exhibitions and in conversations about surviving. One artifact among many that, taken together, make the underside of history visible. Throughout the rest of her life, Keiko never lost the capacity to cry at odd and fitting times. At reunions, at the sight of a child saved from fever, at a puckered photograph of a family she had met on a boat. Those tears were not only for pain, but for the fact of being alive, which often contains both sorrow and gratitude in equal measure. The image captured in the title, Keiko crying as she was rescued by American soldiers, remained a recurrent photograph in the shared imagination of those who knew the story. It was a moment that condensed a long string of months into a visible, human gesture. The photo and the recollection anchored a moral, that a single choice in a moment of rupture, keeping a hand where it belongs, passing a blanket, saying 3 words, can change a life's arc. If the story of Keiko teaches anything, it is that actions of care are not grand gestures alone, but the ordinary accumulation of many small, sane choices. James's insistence on keeping his hand on her shoulder, the medic's clean shirt, the olive green blanket, the bar of chocolate, the pencil the soldier pushed across the page, these were not cures, but they were the scaffolding upon which she could rebuild. And the law's intervention, the trial of Eduardo Reyes, was an institutional acknowledgment that certain acts are punishable and that social recognition matters in the restoration of a person and a record of events. It is important to hold two things at once. The man who abused and the men who helped are individuals who made choices. The nation or the uniform they wore does not explain or excuse what any single person did. Justice was served to the extent the system could carry it, and kindness was offered by people who could have turned away. That ambiguity of heroism folded into ordinary acts, of villainy embodied in a neighbor, makes the story harder and truer. It resists easy narratives. For decades, Keiko kept her sketchbook close, and it became an emblem of survival. She once told a young nurse who asked about the drawings, "Drawings hold things that words can't. They keep a child inside of you alive." The nurse, who had seen both war wounds and ordinary grief, understood what she meant. The act of making marks on paper anchors a person to a future in a small but potent way. Records of names from that period are sometimes inconsistent, and that is a detail worth noting with care. Contemporary accounts list variations of Keiko's surname across different documents, some spellings rendered as Tanakaka in one ledger, Tanaka in another. On official lists, the discrepancy exists. The primary record in the medical tent recorded only Keiko with notes that the surname was inconsistent. For present accuracy, her surname remains unconfirmed in the sources consulted. She is recorded here as Keiko, surname unconfirmed. When people tell this story now, years removed from the timing of events, they sometimes struggle with the complexity. How to speak of care without simplifying the larger harms? How to honor the record of abuse without reducing a person to victimhood? The answer is to hold the image and its implications together. A woman who had been reduced to labor and unfreedom, who was then offered a human counterpoint in the form of simple acts, and who carried both scars and a life forward. There is a broader point in remembering these histories. Too often, the private experiences of civilians in wartime recede beneath big maps and strategies. The sketchbook, the blanket, the chocolate, objects small enough to hold in a hand, remind us that history is accumulated in the small stuff of survival and care. Those details are not sentimental flourishes. They are the mechanisms by which dignity is restored. They are also reminders that humanitarian impulses can make a difference even amid systems that perpetuate harm. Keiko's story ends in the quiet of a life that kept giving and receiving care. She worked in clinics, taught children to draw boats, took long walks by the sea when wind allowed, kept a single lantern by her bedside for years, carried the sketchbook like a talisman, and died having been known, in her later years, as a steady presence in a modest community. Her life was, in the end, both marked by the violence she endured and defined by the many small choices, by strangers and neighbors, that helped her remain in the world. The picture that frames this tale, the Japanese woman crying as American soldiers rescue her from slavery, remains central not because it is tidy or triumphant, but because it contains within itself the messy truth of human history. Pain and care can exist in the same breath. Enemies and friends can be found among neighbors. Law and kindness can both play roles in making a life possible again. To witness that photograph is to press your attention not toward a single moral claim, but toward an insistence that people's choices matter. If you have heard other stories like Keiko's, stories where ordinary acts of care became the hinge for someone's life, please share them in the comments. They matter. They stitch together a more complete sense of what human response can accomplish when systems fail. Subscribe for more untold human stories from wartime, stories that hold both pain and small acts of repair, and that ask us to notice the ordinary choices that restore dignity.